In aperture mode, you're in control of the part of the camera that is able to let in a lot more light. And that is good news when you're photographing in dim light. So you're going to need to be in aperture mode. For that, you'll want to switch the dial on the top of your camera to A, or if you're using a Canon, it's going to say AV, and it's both the same thing. This will allow you to take control of your camera lens's aperture. Now, I've done another video on aperture and the creative effects for getting a blurry background or keeping the background in focus, but aperture also controls how much light is getting into the camera. So if you are in dim light, you want to choose an aperture with the lowest number possible. So apertures are measured in f-stops. You've got a little f there. It doesn't matter if you understand what that is. Basically, just do the right thing with the numbers and things will work out better for you. So you can get a specialty lens, particularly used for portraits, sometimes nature photography. It's a 50mm lens, and it has an aperture of f1.8, which is a really low number, which means your aperture is really, really open, which I'm going to explain in a minute what that means. And it's letting in a lot more light. This lens is amazing for low light situations. The difference between f1.8 and f3.5 is quite a bit. You can actually get a lot more dim light into your photo and get a better, brighter looking photo if you're on f1.8 instead of f3.5. So here is an example of a photo that I took on f1.8, and there was no lights except candlelight. And look at how I was able to get, a fairly bright, it's still a moody, a dark, moody photo, but the parts of the photo that should be bright are bright, and nothing is blurry from motion or anything like that. It's a good, crisp photo with the appropriate level of light, and that's because I was on f1.8. If I was on f8 or f11, this picture never would have happened. So it's okay to use higher numbers like f16 or f22, even f8, f11. These higher numbers are perfectly fine. And in the other video, you learn how these higher numbers are connected to keeping your background in focus. But it doesn't mean that just because you're outside in bright sunlight that you have to go with an aperture of f8 or 11 or 22 or something like that. You don't have to. It's okay. It's perfectly fine in bright light to use these higher numbers. It's just not necessary, especially when you're going for the creative effect of a blurry background. You actually need the lower numbers, such as f1.8 or 3.5. So make sure you watch the other video so that you understand that aperture is doing two things. It's controlling the amount of light that comes in, and it's also controlling whether or not your background will be in focus. Let's talk a little bit more about what an aperture is. An aperture is simply an opening. If you look it up in the dictionary, that's how it defines aperture. It's an opening. You are familiar with openings because they're everywhere. Your coffee mug has an opening. It's a very large opening. Your travel coffee mug has a very small opening. Bottles have openings. Condiment jars have openings. Tunnels have openings. Now, a tunnel has an opening at both ends. And this is much like your camera lens. Your camera lens is like a tunnel. It's got an opening at either end. Now, what's interesting about your camera lens, the opening or the aperture is adjustable. You can open your aperture up and get a good, strong flow of light coming into the water. Just like you can open your sink up and get a good flow of water coming out of your tap. Your tap does have an aperture in it, and it's adjustable. You can open it right up and get a good flow, or you can just get a trickle. So remember, numbers like 1.8, 3.5, those smaller numbers mean your aperture is open, and lots of light is flowing through. And when you close your aperture to numbers like f8 or f22, you're really cutting off the flow of light. Now that's perfectly fine if you're outside in bright sunlight, but inside, this is usually not going to work. Now, remember that this is also connected to whether your background will be in focus or not. And you notice in this photo that this part of the tab is in focus and then this part is blurry. This is because I guarantee they're using an aperture of 1.8 or 3.5. So on the one hand, if they're in a dim lighting situation, they got lots of light coming in, plus they get a blurry background. So two things end up happening. So whenever you find yourself in dim light, open your aperture as much as possible and learn about the relationship or the double job that aperture is doing. It's letting in more light when you need it, but it also controls how much of the background is in focus or not.